Hello, hello, welcome to the 27th episode of BINJ Live. I'm Jason Pramas, your co-host from the Boston Institute for Nonprofit Journalism. And let's see, today below me is my other co-host, the other co-host.
Chris Faraone. I tried using a better mic that last week. It went terribly. We're going to have to figure it out. For now, we're going to go with the in-camera mic. But we have the reason we're taping at a strange time is because we just have a great guest. We wanted to get him in. This is Alex Marthews from the group Digital Fourth. Restore the Fourth. Alex, I'm sorry. You're a tough intro. You got 34 email addresses, different organizations when it's national. But what I want, my intro here is that Alex is like a rapper's rapper. He's a source's source. He is the source that a lot of the sources speak to. I like to talk to him directly. I'm bringing him here. We're bringing him here to speak with our readers. But, you know, his name will be familiar to our reporters. But if we're talking about the Fourth Amendment in Massachusetts, elsewhere as well, we're going to be talking about some federal issues today, some national issues. But privacy, the stuff that people purport to care about and then kind of lose focus of the specifics. Alex has them. So Alex, thank you for joining us. And first, why don't we get that organization and URL down first? I know there's a lot of great information there. So where can people find you? We'll do it at the end too, but.
Sure. So for federal stuff, you can find us at restorethefourth.com with 4 as the number 4. Restore the Fourth because it is the Fourth Amendment, and that is what we like. Locally to the greater Boston area, we have a chapter called Digital Fourth, and our website is at warrantless.org, and you can go there to find the inside details and shenanigans on arguments over privacy and government surveillance that are happening in Boston, Cambridge, Somerville, at the State House, and figure out a little bit of the lay of the land locally. So thanks for having me on, guys. I appreciate it.
No doubt. So we're going to get into some current stuff that's like happening right now. But why don't we, and we're going to get into the history of that. But first, what's the day to day for your organization? What kind of stuff are you keeping an eye on when it's not World Cup season? Like, what are the things when the World Cup's not coming to Massachusetts? What is kind of the year to year, if you will?
Well, privacy is a tough issue to work on, because basically the privacy advocates tend to be teeny tiny funding at this array of different organizations up against, on the commercial side, you've got enormous firms with enormous resources. And on the government side, you've got sort of NSA and FBI, and going down towards the local side, you've got police departments and all of the resources that they can command. So the day-to-day is figuring out where you have leverage in a fight and then mobilizing people to annoy elected officials. We have an informal slogan, which is annoying legislators for freedom.
Now, a lot of this stuff, you say, how much leverage do you have? Now, just generally speaking, because we're going to get into the specifics, we have the time here, but this is the thing that always, and I have trouble even expressing it, but the thing that often drives me kind of nuts about these issues that we speak with you about are like, these are the things that like it's the surveillance mechanism in movies, that in popular culture, that people are like so freaked out about. And then when they are rolled out and normalized, it's almost hard to get people's attention on them. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I'm wondering, this conversation we're going to have today, there's a part of your job, I'd assume, that is to communicate these very sensitive and difficult, tedious issues to the public. Is that how you see it? That's your job also, or is that our job?
I mean, there's a technical element to it, but the broad parameters of the privacy problem is stuff that everybody kind of gets, and everybody kind of notices that we have a lot less privacy than we used to do, and that as part of that, law enforcement and intelligence agencies are in a freaking bonanza golden age of surveillance. and the stuff that they know about it about you in granular detail, and about your associations and where you go and what you do and who you do it with. It is stuff that they couldn't imagine having access to in, say, the early 1990s. This is like the Stasi's wet dream come to life, and done on a partially voluntary basis by the trackers that we all carry around with us, and the ways that we interact with services and firms online. So this is something that people can get, and that, broadly speaking, people don't like. So then the question becomes, what can we do? And where are the pressure points that can slow our walk towards the techno-fascist dystopia?
All right. Well, before I get ahead, Jason knows the history a little bit. You know, for me, I get confused with all the letters. We got a lot of letters going on here. Jason, why don't you you and Alex bring us? You know, because we have time to get centered here. So you said you mentioned the 90s, Alex, but you know.
I just study up before these things. I haven't written about surveillance recently, not as recently as Chris has, but I do. From the time I was one of the Northampton 15 on trial against allowing the CIA to recruit on America's campuses, and managed to survive without going to federal prison, I've had an interest in this stuff. I've just been of the opinion, thanks. I've been of the opinion, though, that especially recent last 10, 15, 20 years, that one should just assume ubiquitous surveillance and there's nothing we can do about it. And I know that I shouldn't be that, kind of negative. But it's tough not to be when we look at something like the law FISA and like what preceded it, which is that, okay, so in the mid 70s, there was something called the Church Commission, right? That was looking at how much American intelligence services and American police services, CIA, FBI, all kinds of, local and state agencies and other national security agencies, of which there are and remain many, were spying on the American public in massive and continuous violation of the Fourth Amendment, the First Amendment, and pretty much every other decent democratic bit of legislation or practice in American governance or jurisprudence. So the kind of enraged and somewhat punchy Democrats of the period, in the wake of the Watergate scandal and what it exposed about this kind of stuff, had this commission to kind of reform these practices, and they established a court where if agencies were doing were trying to supposedly at least deflect foreign intelligence agencies and criminal organizations, and wanted to do this, that, or the other thing, they had to go to this court. And it was all secret, right? So it's a secret court looking at secret activities, which makes one wonder to begin with. But it was something, I think, at least at first. And steadily over the decades since, things have just pretty much gotten worse than they were when the Church Commission was established, as far as I can tell. And then in 2008, we were discussing just before the show right at the end of the Bush administration, but with a Democratic Congress, the law FISA, the Foreign Intelligence. Now I'm forgetting the Surveillance Act, Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act was passed, right? And what did it do, Alex? What do you want to say about all this?
So let me take you through it. So, Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act in 1978 was, you got to think of it as being a more or less sincere effort to rein in domestic surveillance of Americans. Okay, you had foreign surveillance, and then it was trying to set limits around what could be done by these agencies to U.S. persons, which means like citizens and green card holders, fundamentally. And that original FISA was individual in nature. The government thought that an individual was an agent of a foreign power, or was engaged in various espionage-like activity, and they constructed a set of evidence, a dossier of evidence, and the process that was set up was that they would come to this court and that the court would hear from them, not from the person that was going to be surveilled, because it had to be without that person's knowledge. And then the court would decide whether that evidence was good enough to authorize what's called a Title I order against that person.
So the original act, just to be clear, was 1978. I misspoke then, and the court was established. Okay.
It was Ted Kennedy's legislation originally.
Wow.
And you know that family knows what it is like to have a conflicted relationship with the intelligence agencies. So then you cycle forward and you have the 9/11 attacks, and immediately in response to the 9/11 attacks, the Bush administration decides that it is going to conduct mass surveillance on the American people, and to do it not pursuant to any statute at all. If you recall, these were the days of Dick Cheney and unitary executive theory and him snarling to the camera that he was the fourth branch of the US government. And so, you know, he wasn't going to want there to be much law involved. So they set up something called the President's Surveillance Program. The code name that was given it by NSA was Stellar Wind. And they were off to the races because it was post 9/11. And as they put it, the gloves were off. So they collected vast quantities of metadata and communications on US persons and had a party with people's privacy. Then in 2004, a New York Times reporter started looking into this and came to his bosses at the New York Times and said, you know, there's a lot of warrantless surveillance going on that may be unconstitutional. Maybe we should report on this. And the New York Times senior people were kind of like, yes, that's very interesting, but there is an election coming up and we wouldn't want to sort of skew unfairly the presidential election. So let's just wait on this. Eventually, the reporter, and I believe his name was James Rosen, decided that he would. It was like after the election. It was 2005. Bush was reelected, and he was like, "So come on, guys, when are we going to report on this?" And the New York Times was like, "Oh God, all right, Jesus Christ! If you're going to give it to someone else, then we're going to publish it." So that came into public knowledge. At that point, the only people who had an idea of what the administration had been up to were people internal to the executive branch and also the very top people in Congress. So Nancy Pelosi knew and had signed off on it. Steny Hoyer knew and had signed off on it, but basically no one else in Congress.
Not to get into the logistics of government here, but I'm pretty sure that's not how Congress is supposed to work.
Yeah, no, it was just like that was the most congressional accountability that
Okay,
Bush and Cheney could.
We'll talk to like a handful of people out of hundreds.
Yeah. Right. And so, Congress's response to this enormous scope of warrantless surveillance, you might have thought would be to say, well, maybe you should not be doing that. But that was not their reaction. Their reaction was, well, maybe we'll find a way to legitimate most of what you're doing and bring it under statute, and then there'll be some sort of nominal congressional oversight over what you're doing, because we're afraid that if we go too hard on the whole knowing about what you're doing thing, then you'll just go off and do it secretly and we won't have any insight into it at all. So the result was something called the FISA Amendments Act of 2008. And I believe that then freshman Senator Barack Obama and shortly President Barack Obama did vote for it. But what that did was to legitimate under FISA programmatic, not individual surveillance. So they created something called Title VII and something called Section 702. Right. And they were like, okay, in order to make this massive surveillance even theoretically constitutional, you've got to connect it in some way to foreigners. Back in 1978, hardly anybody communicated with foreigners. To make an international call, even if you could make an international call to another country, which you couldn't to every country, then it would cost you $25 a minute. So
Yeah, in the early 80s, my mother, as a secretary at a high-tech company in Cambridge, they had a telex machine. It was the first time I'd ever seen such a thing, right? And that was one of the few ways
Well,
one could
also,
do this.
there'd probably literally be somebody, an operator listening for most of that call. Like, you'd have to be really talking in code. So yeah, I'm sure that the people who are actually spies figured out ways to do it by then. I'm sure that this wasn't really stopping much.
But by 2008, obviously people were communicating internationally a lot more, but the framework was still the same, that domestic American to American communications might be protected, but communications of Americans with foreigners, you didn't have to accord the same level of protection to it under the jurisprudence. So what they did was this. They said, okay, NSA gets the right to designate targets under this program, the 702 program. Those targets will always be non-US persons located outside the United States. And the way that they talk about this program now, they're always like, okay, the targets, this program does not target Americans, is their phrase. And the targets they talk about are like, it's the terrorists and the hackers and the Iranians. And the actual criterion under law is not any of that. It's just like, does this person have foreign intelligence information of interest to the United States? And that could be anybody. That could be Nobel Peace Prize winner Malala Yousafzai. It could be a whole heap of people who have not done anything wrong, but nevertheless have information of interest to the NSA.
That number.
Yeah.
I mean, the punchline is insane, and I just want to stop. Right? So, and as it applies to where you're going here and everything here, is there anyone who, like the way that we have more prison reform to some degree in the South for economic reasons than we do in the North? Like, is there anyone who's saying we're building this giant stockpile and it's impossible to find out who's doing anything wrong? Like this sense, I know we hear this sometimes from advocates, like privacy advocates like you. During this whole, so the 2001 to 2008, is there anyone important who is questioning this flip where we're now collecting just everything? Because that's where we're going here, where everything's just getting collected. Is there any voice against it?
The main voice against it in Congress was and continues to be Senator Ron Wyden of Oregon, who designed a lot of internet law in the 1990s and has always been very focused on people's privacy. He is a member of the Senate Intelligence Committee. They probably made a mistake letting him onto that committee, but that's done now. And so he is privy to a lot of things, but also if he reveals classified information, then they'll kick him off the committee. So he has a delicate path to walk in terms of alerting people there is something wrong, but I cannot say to you in a public setting what is wrong. That dynamic is still going on. But so for the targets under 702, there are currently 350,000 of them.
Wow.
And then NSA has the right for foreign intelligence collection purposes to gather the communications of all of those 350,000 people. No, this is not all of the surveillance NSA is doing. This is just this one program, okay? And it's just that this is the one that Congress is currently sort of vaguely willing to reform. So those people, just by definition, because they have foreign intelligence information that is of interest to the United States in particular, they are presumably communicating with at least some Americans. And so that in turn means that the privacy rights of millions of Americans who happen to be communicating with foreigners who happen to have been targeted by NSA as being interesting the privacy rights of those Americans are implicated because NSA gathers it and then other agencies dip into it at will. So vast communications database, and then FBI comes along and goes, oh, we've got this protester, or we've got this person visiting FBI headquarters, and we know this is a really big database of communications. Let's just take a look and see whether that person is in it and has done the suspicious act of communicating with a foreign national. So, for example, during the Black Lives Matter protests, FBI under the first Trump administration was anxious to find ways to find out more about the people organizing the protests. And there were FBI agents who were very willing to believe that no true red-blooded American could possibly have sincere and spontaneous objections to police violence. And that therefore perhaps it was being funded by the Russians or by the Iranians or by the North Koreans or by anyone. And so hypothetically, they could just dip into this database and check and just see whether these Black Lives Matter organizers had been in contact with and being funded by foreign powers. And if not, then, well, they got to see their communications anyway, and there were no consequences for them in doing so.
Well, there's a banana peel on the slippery slope.
Yes, yeah. Indeed. And the mere fact that they were looking at that database and thinking, well, yes, we are going to be able to find the communications of 150 different Black Lives Matter protest organizers in it, shows you how large this communication database is. Because they clearly had that reasonable expectation and it paid off for them. That passed Congress in 2008. It was renewed in 2012. Edward Snowden comes out of the NSA in 2013 and goes, yeah, well, there is a lot more surveillance happening and Congress is only partially aware of it. And it includes, for example, all of the metadata of all of the cell phone calls that are made within the United States. And you really should take a look at that. In 2015, Congress passed transparency reforms, which meant that, for example, the rulings of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, some of them now get made public after like 15 to 18 months. In 2019, they renewed this power again. In 2024, with a bill called RISA, they renewed it, expanded it in 3 disturbing ways, and refused to add significant reforms. And the reforms that they added were basically, okay, we're going to trust that the FBI is well run by competent people because Joe Biden's got this. And so we're going to add like internal sign-offs, and we're going to reduce the number of FBI agents who have routine access to this database. And we're going to just see how that goes. And it'll be okay because if there are abuses, then the Privacy and Civil Liberties Oversight Board or the Inspector Generals will do their job professionally, and the FBI attorneys will honestly inform the courts as to any abuses that may be occurring.
So we won't have a drunk blogger as FBI director was the thinking, right?
Well, no, like, who would do that?
Yeah, that could never happen.
I hate to give the Democrats any credit, but you can't, because it's funny. It's like they're either way, they think it's either a political agency for them or it's a non-political agency. But the third choice, that it's a political agency for their adversaries, just never doesn't dawn on it. Because you said 2000, we're talking about 2024 here. This is recent history, and you told me that 70% of Democrats went along with it. And my question here is like, I asked you before, like the forces pushing that 30% are you and a handful of others. I assume the ACLU, some of the larger advocacy organizations. I don't see a lot from the public. Are we blaming the media here? I mean, why isn't there more of it? People really, even with, I agree with what Jason said. I know that, we're not literally. A lot of people aren't have the same expectation of privacy that they used to. But
that is true. So there's a certain amount of privacy doomerism out there. But it is also the case that for the sort of mainstream media, let's say, if they have people who they perceive to be credible, and in this context, it was the Biden administration and Director Wray at the FBI, and the sober and responsible inside the Beltway people who take national security seriously, telling them that this is a very important power and that people should not mess with it or undermine it, then the way that they report on it is going to frame it in a way that minimizes the impacts to everyday Americans' privacy.
Right.
So that was the dynamic. At the same time, there has been this real interesting counter dynamic, and that is all about President Trump. Now, if we were talking about a timeline where Jeb Bush had won in 2016, then we would not be seeing a Republican Party with a significant number of people in it who were obsessing about FISA. And about surveillance. As it is, during the 2016 campaign, there was a Trump campaign operative who was spied on under Title I of FISA. So this was the individual process that still goes on. And Carter Page was being suspected by the FBI of having improper contacts with the Russian government. They put together an affidavit which actually was a kind of trash affidavit because nobody really reviewed in an external fashion whether that affidavit was accurate at every point in the way that they were supposed to. They put that to the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court and they approved surveillance on Carter Page. But as a consequence of that, Trump got big mad and went on lengthy rants on Twitter and then later on Truth Social about spying on his campaign, about how unacceptable it was.
As late as 2024, he was doing this.
That's right. And it was, and so it was a little bit orthogonal to the Section 702 surveillance that is at issue right now. But if you're concerned about one part of FISA, you tend to be concerned about other parts. And what it did was to create the political space for people to run as Republicans and to say, yeah, well, I'm loyal to President Trump, and President Trump is concerned about people's privacy under FISA, and so am I. Yep. And therefore, I'm going to advance appropriate reforms for it the key reform that reformers have been looking to do here, whether Democrat or Republican, is to insist that if other agencies dip into this already collected information, then and it's for a US person and it's not a life or death emergency, then they get a warrant for doing that. Okay. And there is a secondary reform that we have been advocating and asking for as a coalition. And that is to say, okay, there's a ton of information that is out there on US persons. There's commercially available information. This is the kind of stuff that data brokers have on you.
That's right.
It's the kind of stuff that Equifax has on you. It's the kind of stuff that Thomson Reuters and other folks have on you, all Palantir stitches together on you. Okay.
The Fourth Amendment Not for Sale Act.
Yes, you have that. And so the proposition there is, if you have a government agency and they want to acquire information on a US person, and if they would require a warrant in order to acquire it directly, then they need a warrant in order to acquire that from a third party like a data broker. Same information, just having a different pathway shouldn't mean that you can get around the requirement to have a warrant. So those two warrant requirement requests are the core requests of reformers.
And I just got to say, Alex, as a journalist, reporting based show, the irony of how much more difficult information becomes to obtain for reporters and advocates like you when it goes to these third parties, and how much easier it potentially becomes for police departments, other law enforcement. So whatever this legislation is, I think it'd be great if state law enforcement looked at this kind of language, because frankly, we need it for everything, in my
Law
opinion.
enforcement's been pushing back on this kind of reform request, though, right? As if they don't already get warrants for many other things. They're like, oh, we can't possibly get warrants for this. It would be too much. Is that correct?
They certainly have been pushing back on this. But it's really important to include state and local law enforcement in this reform, because if you don't, then what will happen is FBI will be under a warrant requirement. Go to an FBI Joint Terrorism Task Force, and they'll talk to the person who's seconded to that from state or local law enforcement and say to them, well, we can't do this without a warrant, but you can. So you go get this information and then share it with us, and that would be completely legal.
So, Alex, the up to date is that, so where are we, and what are like the best possible outcomes here? What are we in the process of right now as far as the extensions and such?
So right now it's a really interesting situation with Congress. You've got a very narrow majority that Speaker Johnson has in the House, and Speaker Johnson does not want reform. However, he has about 20 Republicans who are giving him grief on this topic. And on the Democratic side, relative to 2 years ago, Democrats are newly sensitized to some of the data privacy risks that might be involved with having, say, Kash Patel in charge of the FBI and a president who appears not to be stable enough to be able to keep it together, even in security briefings on the Iran war. That amount of Democrats plus 20 Republicans translates into a huge headache for Speaker Johnson in trying to do what Trump is now saying that he wants, which is amazing now that he is president again. He now thinks that these powers are just fabulous and ought to be renewed, because how else are you going to get the Antifa?
Yes, the Antifa.
Yes, the Antifa, and I appreciate you, Antifa General Jason, and you, Antifa Colonel Chris.
Wow.
And so he
I wasn't the black bloc back in the day, but okay.
Yeah, exactly. So big headache for him. Our coalition has now managed to block him 4 times in trying to reauthorize this. And we've fought him down to last time he threw up his hands and was like, okay, the Senate has sent over a 45-day reauthorization of this power so that they and we can have some more discussions, and like, fine, all right, 45 days, we'll do it. I wanted 5 years. You're not giving me 5 years. You all suck. So we are now in that 45-day period. And the FISA Title VII expires on June 12th. So we are figuring out with our allies what kind of package deal of reauthorization of the statute plus some key reforms is going to muster a majority in both chambers of Congress. It's important to observe here that there's a lot of fear-mongering that the speaker and surveillance hawks like to do about the lapse of this authority. And they love to go to members of Congress and say, well, you do not want to have another 9/11 here, do you? And you do not want it to be your fault. So if we go 3 minutes past the deadline for the renewal of this authority, then we are all going to be mashed into a pulp by a suitcase nuke being carried by a suspicious Iranian-looking guy. And having seen multiple iterations of this discussion, the enemy always shifts, but it's always going to be you're going to die in your beds the next morning.
Right.
But the fact is that actually, the way that this power was configured in 2008, you can have the statute lapse, and program collection just continues. It continues for nearly a year. And all of the tech firms that are providing data through this, they still get fined $250,000 a day if they refuse to participate, even with the statute lapsed. So what that means is that this fear-mongering is completely without basis.
And are we past? Are we, not that we are going to get into it now, and certainly we've written about it. But are we way past any evidentiary debate? Are there still cases being brought up on both sides? We wouldn't have solved this crime, or on the other side. I mean, how much do we hear about the gross violations of privacy that led to this? I mean, what are some of the examples on your side that you use? This person was investigated for this. They were just walking through a traffic signal. I mean, what are we looking at here?
Well, so one element of this is obviously protest surveillance,
right,
and protest organizer surveillance. One element of this is any kind of desire by FBI agents to look at people who interest them, and that could be, for example, attractive women who have attracted the attention of FBI or NSA agents.
Honeypots, Alex. Yes, they must be examined carefully.
Yes, particularly they have to get real deep into the honeypot issue. It can be surveillance of religious congregations. So under Republican administrations, it tends to be improper surveillance of mosques. Under Biden, actually, there was surveillance of radical traditionalist Catholics, was the FBI phrase, and also of congregations that were gathering unwisely and singing praise during COVID. And so there is a dimension that can resonate with Republicans on this, but also there has been surveillance of elected officials and of donors to elected officials. And that tends to get members of Congress kind of annoyed that has been going on.
And so we've spoken, to bring it home, we've spoken about some of the pressure that can be applied in Massachusetts. We have a particularly powerful Congresswoman in Catherine Clark. But in general, not in general, when this issue, there's a month ago, and I think, you've dropped some science on us, so we're going to get some burn here. What do we put in the thing? What should people do? What's feasible? I mean, even as a reporter, it's a little intimidating to get into it about surveillance issues with a policy person. Not that people should be afraid to. People should be up for calling their members of Congress. But what's the simple message? Or what's a good resource for people to look at? Besides, of course, what we're going to generate from this interview at BINJ.news.
No, so the simple thing to do, the helpful thing to do, is to get Democratic leadership to move decisively on this. We already have the Congressional Progressive Caucus and the Congressional Hispanic Caucus and the Congressional Asian Caucus and the Congressional Black Caucus highlighting that this is an issue and that these powers need reform. But for leadership, for folks like Catherine Clark and Hakeem Jeffries, they already have their eye on the presidency of President Newsom or President Buttigieg or whoever it's going to be, and they want to preserve these powers as much as they can. They want to preserve the ability of NSA to tap secretly into every business network in the United States. They want to preserve the ability of under this power, the communications of anyone to be collected who is applying for any immigration benefit from the United States and the people they communicate with. Because it is just a matter of like, yeah, we should do this. This is all useful. It all gives us information. And besides, the Chinese are doing 50% more. So they need to be lit up. They need to be required to decisively be saying to the Democratic caucus, you need to support warrant reforms for FISA. That is the top line here.
Because the larger Democratic caucus.
Frankly, we have a government that is going hog wild with surveillance, and they are being explicit about it. And they are saying, actually, dissenting against what we're doing with ICE is terrorism, and we're going to investigate it as such. They could not be being more blatant that they have a lot of power here that has been accrued by every administration since 9/11, and that they firmly intend to use it. So as part of Democrats standing up against abuses of ICE and of DOJ and of abuses at the FBI, this has to be a key part of it, even if that's a part of these powers that they kind of like. And you can add warrants without harming the overall utility of the foreign surveillance that is being gathered. One hilarious thing that has been advanced against our position is a CIA fact sheet that was published, and they said, well, you can't do any reforms to 702 because otherwise Taylor Swift would have died.
Oh God, I got it.
Yes.
Wow.
Because apparently there were some people who were planning to bomb a Taylor Swift concert in Austria. But if you put warrant protections in for the communications of U.S. persons who are located in the U.S., there's nothing to suggest publicly that the people who are planning to bomb a Taylor Swift concert in Austria were U.S. persons.
Right.
Probably they were Austrians. Maybe they were Germans. You've got a whole.
Also, didn't they detonate the thing, or is it just a plot?
It was a plot that they apparently disrupted. And I do not, in fact, want Tay-Tay to die. I am glad.
Right. She could be the next president. It's often been spoken of.
Just for clarification. But I think, and reformers are pretty clear on that it is perfectly possible to reform these powers and inhibit the domestic surveillance while preserving the foreign surveillance utility of this power.
Excellent. All right. Well, I appreciate it. Well, Jason, you have anything? We got a lot to chew on here.
We do, and I don't want to, drag the show on, too long, but I will ask. Journalists have occasion to speak to people in other countries. Might journalists such as we not be being surveilled? What was that, Chris?
You do quite a bit. You got friends all over the place.
I got friends all over the place. Yeah. So are journalists being surveilled? Has this been uncovered?
There has been surveillance of journalists under 702. And obviously your error here, Jason, is that you do communicate with and try to get the unfiltered perceptions of people in other countries. You should just be going to these Department of Defense briefings and to not publish anything embarrassing about the U.S. government that contradicts the U.S. government line. And then you will not be a target. So really, it's completely different.
It's my fault. Yeah. I'm so sorry. Yeah,
exactly. You should be ashamed. My God.
I know, right? We also might interview people that have been surveilled and then get caught up in the surveillance anyway. If there's any of 1,000 reasons we could end up being surveilled through this particular program.
Vulnerable because these kinds of surveillance powers operate through network analysis, right?
Yep.
And let's say even if they are talking to somebody that the US government designates as a terrorist, like, for example, Nelson Mandela,
Sure.
and journalists sometimes are interested in talking to Nelson Mandela, or were when he was alive. And those people would be identified by NSA as having a suspicious set of contacts to somebody who was a suspected terrorist. And then, yes, that journalist would be surveilled. And because it's an automated and large-scale system, the US doesn't keep a database of who is and is not a journalist, so they're not going to be able to categorically exclude you. Unless you have a warrant rule that says that before you are seizing or searching the communications of a US person, you have to go to an independent judge who assesses whether there is probable cause that you're involved in an actual crime. That's some sort of what we could call it the Fourth Amendment, and and apply that if we wanted.
Right. From the Constitution, which is the ultimate law of the land. Right. Well, what a forward-thinking idea that is to go back
fresh
to the
out of
1700s.
1791, baby.
Yeah, there you go. Okay, thank you. That's fascinating and terrifying, but not particularly surprising. My remarks at the beginning of the show taken as given. So, Chris, anything else from you?
We had some live viewers today. We don't do it for the live, people come around, but thanks for those out listening. And we got to give Alex the credit for those who stuck around, because he is captivated. That's why I said we had the early part of this conversation the other day, and I said, you know what, dude, just hold it. We got to do this. We got to record this.
On air. Yeah.
We'll be following up with some of those details, but we appreciate your time as always. And I think we'll just have you come on in a month and talk about flock safety and see where we are with all that. I didn't want to say the word.
That's a whole other conversation.
It's a whole other conversation.
And
the truth is, I don't want to confuse it, is the truth. And ALPRs, I really want to take people from the beginning, because it's one of those things, like when we write about these issues, and I know I don't want to lose people from the get-go. So it is a different thing, and certainly tied into a greater surveillance network, but a whole other issue. We'll talk about it soon.
Cool. So, thanks very much for coming on the show, Alex Marthews of Restore the Fourth. And folks out there, viewers, please check out, if you're interested in these disturbing developments, and I think you should be. Down the bottom of the screen, we've been running the two websites, where Alex and his colleagues are doing all their good work, and you can find out all about it. Get involved. Restore the Fourth with a 4 and warrantless.org. Restore the Fourth with a 4.com and warrantless.org. So thanks again, Alex. And we'll be back next Tuesday. We believe at 8 p.m. We're interviewing our former intern, but current binge writer, Madison Lucchese. So thanks, folks. And we're going to press the end stream button now. We're going to freeze like the end of Family Guy in one funny episode. Bye, everybody.